What is it with you and eating the white balance, James? Good Lord. Where is your mother?
Many thousands of miles away.
Hi, I'm Emme.
And I am James.
And welcome back to the Bestiary Monster Manual A through Z. And James, what are we talking about today?
What's that in the tree? On that tree? It's the Dryad.
It might very well be. So today, Dryads. They are a fey creature that inhabits trees. These guys are pretty straightforward to the myths upon which they are based. They are fey creatures that have, for many various reasons, have been tied to a tree. This may have been a punishment. It's specified in here that one of the more common punishments is because they fell in love with a mortal creature and it was forbidden, so their court bound them to the material plane as a punishment.
So often, for whatever reason that they're there, they'll be acting as guardians, inhabiting the trees in forested areas, being joined by other sort of fantasy, fey, woodland creatures like unicorns or treants or satyrs. It's kind of like a nice condensed forest fantasy chunk you can get with these creatures. And yeah, they are defenders of nature. So if you're a druid, there's a high chance that you might have interacted with one of these, met them, worked with them, perhaps even been allied with them at some point.
Quite possibly. These creatures are neutral, as many fey creatures are. They are alien and a little bit unknowable because of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, they are involved with other creatures that are typically good. They're bound to nature, and so having met one of these creatures, if you are a character who's been involved in nature in any way, not an unlikely chance.
Yeah. So, yeah, in terms of their background, in terms of what their inspiration is, in terms of their existence in 5th edition D&D, pretty simple. And I think that's actually quite well reflected in the art. It's certainly a nice piece of artwork. I really like how the leaves that you can see here sort of shift into different features of the figure, but it's a tree plant spirit person.
I quite agree. I love the lighting. I love the ephemeral nature. Very much looks like an impressionist painting of leaves where there's the dots of color that form the leaves, which form the Dryad. And there's that sense of movement throughout the light, throughout the art, throughout the branches and leaves that are covering this particular Dryad, the shifting nature of the color along her skin. It's quite beautiful and quite simple.
I actually quite like that while the figure here is sort of quite shifting and almost formless in some sense, the face is very defined. It's quite angular. It's got that darkness around the eyes. So there's a beauty there, but also a power.
The expression on her face is very focused and driven, and I completely agree with those clear, sharp eyes. This is a watcher. This is a guardian. This is somebody who is watching you and has high emotions. While it may be implacable and guarded beneath this unknowable, reclusive fey nature, the emotions are still present, even if they're not necessarily emotions that we can connect with and recognize. The shape of the face, everything about it is so distinct. And again, not necessarily human looking.
I mean, here it's depicted in a more sort of humanoid feminine sense, but they will not necessarily appear in that way. There's nothing to say that these can't be more masculine in appearance or even more androgynous, which I quite like.
That's very much up to, again, the DM. There's a lot of room for personality in this because the Dryad is a person. It is more than just a monster here. This is, again, one of these stats in the Monster Manual that's a humanoid-ish person with emotions and motives and personality, and one Dryad to the next is going to be very, very different.
Yeah, I mean, even perhaps reflecting the nature of the tree that they are bound to. You know, perhaps, an oak Dryad is very stoic and powerfully built in their appearance, But what of the birch or the ash? Perhaps quite different.
Yes, and on that note, attaching them to the tree, there is also what happens to them if the tree is destroyed. So I know a lot more traditionally you will see if you destroy the tree, you destroy the Dryad. But in this case, since they were originally tied to it from the Feywild, this Dryad's actually just driven quite insane, which is a plot hook.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways in which you can make a Dryad not necessarily an antagonist, but definitely build quests at low level or higher around what happens when a Dryad is separated from its tree or that tree is cut down. Because even in their appearance, they will reflect the health and vibrancy of the particular tree that they are bound to. And so, yeah, the question of, well, what happens if one of those is cut down could produce some very interesting quest ideas.
Yes, and this guy screams ambiance. Everything about from the madness of one if it's cut down, what its punishment was that tied it to the tree, the nature of the forest itself. Again, going back to if you're a druid, you might have met one of these. Maybe this is somebody that your player character has met in the past. Maybe this is somebody you stumble upon that has a quest, has something it needs from you. Maybe it has gone on a rampage in a nearby village. Maybe it's one of those things where when you walk into a forest, which is extremely ancient and magical, you see one walk from tree to tree and you just have that moment of...
Yeah, tone and setting established. Like, just such a simple thing with really a fairly simple creature completely sets up the feeling that your players, or at least part of what your players should be feeling at that moment. Yeah, and I think that's a real strength of, when you draw inspiration for creatures in the Monster Manual from these very traditional myths and legends, your players have an almost inbuilt reaction to that. Like, you know what that represents.
Immediately. And especially considering that one of these is not really going to provide a huge threat unless your party is at level 1. They're a challenge rating 1. They have some fairly straightforward druid spells, Entangle, Goodberry. They have a charm effect, which is actually a little nasty and quite hilarious that some of your less wise party members might fall prey to, that you can view this Dryad as friendly.
Yep. It, of course, has its Shillelagh Club attack. But I think it would probably not use that as a primary means of defending itself. And while, with an AC of 11 and only 22 hit points, really not that much of a challenge, these things aren't going to put themselves in a position where they're going to be easy to kill. Like, if you start to damage and hurt this thing, it's just going to be, right, okay, peace out, I'm in a tree now.
Yeah, and it's got trees
now I'm
dried,
in another tree.
So
now
it can
I'm
just
in another
leave.
tree.
So while they might guard portions of a whole forest, unless you are literally chopping down its tree, I'm imagining that it's probably just going to leave. And it's unless you lock it down, it's going to be kind of hard to catch, which I think provides the primary challenge that the Dryad presents.
Yeah, agreed. If you do find yourself in a position where you must absolutely kill one of these things, that might be harder to do than you actually think. Thank you so much for joining us again this week here at the Bestiary. Have you ever been walking in the woods and could have sworn you saw a pair of eyes peeking out at you from one of the nearby trees? Tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And while you're there, you can give this video a like, you can hit the bell to be notified of when we release new content, you can subscribe to join the Adventurers Pack, we would sure love to have you. And there you can also find links to our various social media, and including a link to our Patreon if you feel like supporting us a little more substantially. We adore our patrons and would love to have you among them. Join us next week when we delve into the Underdark once more to find the Durgar.